You may believe your calm came from learning how to control yourself. You may tell yourself that age softened you, disappointment humbled you, or exhaustion finally taught you which battles were not worth fighting. But beneath these explanations is a more unsettling possibility. You are calm because you are no longer spending every moment defending an image of who you think you are. That kind of calm is rare. It does not come from becoming harmless, agreeable, or emotionally numb. It appears when you have stopped running from the parts of yourself that once frightened you. Your anger no longer needs to erupt because you can admit that it exists. Your envy no longer poisons your relationships because you can recognize what it reveals. Your selfishness no longer hides behind endless sacrifice because you have learned to name your own desires without disguising them as duty. Carl Jung spent decades studying this transformation. He saw that the personality does not become whole by removing its darkness. It becomes whole by developing a conscious relationship with everything the ego once rejected. Jung called these rejected qualities the shadow, not because they were always evil, but because they had been pushed outside the light of your conscious identity. You formed that shadow long before you had the language to understand what you were doing. You learned which emotions earned affection and which ones created distance. You discovered which parts of your temperament were welcomed and which ones caused discomfort. Perhaps you were praised for being mature, so you buried your neediness. Perhaps you were rewarded for being gentle, so you disowned your aggression. Perhaps you survived by becoming useful, agreeable, quiet, independent, intelligent, spiritual, or endlessly understanding. Every identity you built required an opposite to be hidden. When you became the responsible one, someone inside you became reckless. When you became the peacemaker, someone inside you became furious. When you became the selfless one, someone inside you began keeping a private record of every sacrifice. When you became the strong one, someone inside you waited desperately for permission to collapse. Your former calm depended on keeping those opposites under control. It was not peace, it was management. You monitored your words before speaking. You softened your opinions to avoid disapproval. You rehearsed explanations for choices that required no defense. You gave people access to you long after your body had begun resisting their presence. You called this patience. You called it kindness. You called it maturity. But your nervous system knew the difference between kindness and self-erasure. The rare calm that follows shadow integration feels different because it requires less effort. You no longer need to maintain a constant border between the person you present and the person you secretly fear you might be. You have seen enough of yourself to know that anger does not make you cruel. Desire does not make you corrupt. Weakness does not make you worthless. And power does not automatically make you dangerous. You become less reactive because there is less inside you that must remain unknown. This is the psychological mechanism beneath the change. What remains unconscious does not become inactive. It operates through projection, compulsion, resentment, idealization, moral certainty, and sudden emotional intensity. The shadow does not disappear when you refuse to acknowledge it. It gains influence precisely because you do not recognize its voice as your own. Jung mapped this with clinical precision. He understood that the ego wants to experience itself as coherent, good, and in control. Anything that threatens this self-image is pushed outward. You then encounter your rejected qualities in other people. The arrogance you cannot admit becomes unbearable when you see confidence in someone else. The neediness you despise in yourself makes another person's vulnerability feel suffocating. The ambition you buried becomes evidence that successful people are shallow, greedy, or morally compromised. Projection protects your identity, but it distorts your reality. You do not see the other person clearly. You see the part of yourself you have refused to meet. A woman sits at the edge of her bed after another argument. Her phone lights up beside her, but she does not reach for it. She remembers calling the other person controlling, then notices how carefully she had tried to manage every response. Her hand rests on the silent screen while she admits, perhaps for the first time, that control was not only something being done to her. That admission is painful because it removes innocence. Shadow work does not ask you to blame yourself for everything that happened. It asks you to stop protecting yourself with a version of events in which all darkness belongs to someone else. You can recognize mistreatment without pretending you have never manipulated. You can acknowledge betrayal without denying the ways you abandoned yourself. You can hold another person responsible without using their wrongdoing to escape your own responsibility. This is where your calm begins to deepen. You no longer need every conflict to prove that you are good. You become more interested in what is true. Before integration, disagreement often feels like a threat to your identity. A criticism does not remain a criticism. It becomes evidence that you are inadequate, misunderstood, rejected, or exposed. Because the ego has invested so heavily in maintaining a particular image, even a small challenge can awaken a defensive response far larger than the moment itself. You explain too much. You counterattack. You withdraw dramatically. You become cold. You replay the conversation for hours, building a case in which your motives were pure and the other person's motives were corrupt. After integration, you can feel the wound without allowing it to become the entire truth. Jung understood that a complex can temporarily take possession of the personality. A present event touches an old emotional structure, and suddenly you are no longer responding only to what is happening now. You are responding to every humiliation, abandonment, or dismissal that resembles it. The intensity feels justified, because the complex carries years of accumulated emotion. A man receives a brief message from a colleague asking to revise a piece of work. He reads it 3 times, then opens a reply and types a paragraph defending every decision. His jaw tightens as he imagines being treated like the incompetent child his father once accused him of being. After several minutes, he deletes the paragraph and writes, "I'll take another look." The integrated response is not passive, it is proportionate. You are allowed to feel the old wound. You simply no longer require the present moment to carry the full weight of your history. This creates a quietness that other people may misinterpret. They may assume you no longer care. They may believe you have become distant, less passionate, or difficult to provoke. In reality, you have stopped donating your entire nervous system to every misunderstanding. Your calm is not the absence of feeling, it is the absence of possession. You can experience anger without becoming anger. You can feel shame without building your identity around it. You can notice jealousy without turning it into accusation. You can recognize fear without allowing it to make every decision. The shadow becomes less dangerous when you stop treating every difficult emotion as evidence against your character. Jung saw the shadow as morally challenging because it contains qualities the conscious personality does not want to claim. Yet, it also contains vitality. Buried beside cruelty may be assertiveness. Buried beside selfishness may be self-preservation. Buried beside envy may be unlived ambition. Buried beside lust may be aliveness. Buried beside rebellion may be the capacity to resist an authority that has exceeded its rightful place. When you reject the entire shadow, you do not eliminate only what is destructive. You also lose access to the energy trapped inside it. A quiet employee remains late again, while everyone else leaves. She notices resentment rising, as she closes another unfinished document. She has always considered herself generous and dependable, but her generosity has become a way of avoiding the guilt of saying no. The next morning, she tells her manager that the deadline must change, and her voice shakes even though her words remain clear. What you once called selfishness may have been the undeveloped ability to protect your own life. This is one reason integrated people seem unusually settled. They are no longer trying to produce goodness through self-denial alone. They understand that kindness without aggression becomes submission. Compassion without boundaries becomes complicity. Forgiveness without discernment becomes repeated exposure to harm. They do not worship the qualities that once made them acceptable. You may have spent years trying to become more patient when what you needed was permission to become less available. You may have practiced understanding people whose behavior required consequences. You may have searched for spiritual meaning in situations that were asking for a direct refusal. Integration changes the question. Instead of asking, "How can I remain the person everyone believes me to be?" you begin asking, "What is this moment requiring from the whole of me?" Sometimes the answer is tenderness. Sometimes it is confrontation. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is departure. Your calm grows because you are no longer trapped inside a single approved response. You also stop needing other people to carry the qualities you refuse to embody. Before integration, you may be drawn compulsively toward people who express your unlived life. The cautious person becomes fascinated by recklessness. The emotionally restrained person becomes consumed by someone unpredictable. The dutiful person falls under the spell of someone who refuses responsibility. The person who has denied ambition becomes obsessed with a charismatic figure who openly pursues status and power. The attraction feels fated because the other person appears to possess something missing from your conscious identity. Jung described this kind of fascination as more than ordinary preference. The psyche seeks wholeness, and it often places the image of your unlived potential onto someone outside you. You believe you need the person, when part of what you need is the quality you have projected onto them. A man watches a friend speak confidently at a crowded table. He laughs with everyone else, but later becomes irritated and calls the friend attention-seeking. On the drive home, he imagines what he would have said if he had not spent the evening waiting for permission to enter the conversation. His criticism begins to loosen when he recognizes the courage hidden inside his contempt. What fascinates or enrages you may be carrying a fragment of your own abandoned life. As you reclaim that fragment, the emotional charge changes. You may still admire the person, but you no longer need to possess them. You may still dislike their behavior, but your dislike becomes cleaner. You stop asking them to live your boldness, your sensuality, your rebellion, your confidence, or your freedom on your behalf. This produces a profound reduction in drama. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. You no longer interpret obsession as evidence of destiny. You no longer believe that another person has arrived to complete a part of you that you are unwilling to develop. You become calmer because your unlived life is no longer shouting at you through strangers. Integration also changes your relationship with moral certainty. Before you have confronted your own shadow, it is tempting to divide the world into clear categories: good people and bad people, conscious people and unconscious people, healers and narcissists, empaths and manipulators, awakened people and those who remain asleep. These categories can contain truth, but they can also protect you from complexity. They allow you to locate innocence inside your group and darkness somewhere else. Jung warned repeatedly against identifying too completely with virtue. The stronger your conscious claim to purity, the more likely the opposite quality is operating beyond your awareness. A person who needs to believe they are always compassionate may become quietly coercive in the name of helping. A person who identifies as honest may use truth as a weapon. A person devoted to peace may punish disagreement through silence and withdrawal. A father lectures his family about respect, then interrupts each person who tries to answer. He believes he is defending order. His daughter lowers her eyes and stops speaking, while he remains convinced that the conversation ended peacefully. The aggression he condemns in others has entered the room through his certainty. What you refuse to recognize in yourself does not become virtuous. It becomes invisible. When you begin integrating the shadow, your moral language becomes more precise. You can condemn an action without pretending you are incapable of causing harm. You can recognize manipulation without assuming all your own motives are transparent. You can set firm boundaries without constructing an identity based on being more evolved than the person you are leaving. This humility does not make you indecisive. It makes your decisions less contaminated by superiority. You may still say no. You may still end the relationship. You may still refuse reconciliation. You may still name cruelty, dishonesty, exploitation, or abuse. But you no longer need hatred to authorize your boundary. That is one of the rarest forms of calm. You can protect yourself without turning the other person into a monster. You can recognize their humanity without offering them continued access. You can leave without rehearsing a speech in which you finally force them to understand what they did. You stop confusing closure with agreement. The integrated person knows that some people will preserve a version of you that protects their own psychology. They may call you selfish because your compliance once benefited them. They may call you cold because your emotional labor is no longer available. They may accuse you of changing because you have stopped performing the role in which they felt safest. You do not need to correct every interpretation. Jung's process of individuation requires a gradual separation from collective expectations. This does not mean rejecting society or treating yourself as exceptional. It means developing an inner authority strong enough to distinguish your actual values from the identities rewarded by your family, culture, community, or social circle. A woman stands in her kitchen after a family gathering. She rinses a cup while replaying a relative's remark about how distant she has become. For years, she responded to such comments with apologies and promises to visit more. This time, she places the cup on the rack, notices the familiar guilt, and allows it to remain without making a new promise. What you experience as guilt may be the emotional cost of no longer betraying yourself automatically. This is why integrated calm can feel lonely at first. You are no longer participating in certain emotional contracts, yet you have not fully learned who you are without them. The old identity is weakening. The new center is still forming. You may miss the intensity of being needed. You may miss the certainty of being the victim, rescuer, rebel, responsible one, or misunderstood outsider. Even painful identities provide structure. They tell you what to expect from yourself and from everyone around you. Integration removes those familiar scripts. Without them, you must encounter each situation more honestly. You cannot assume that because you were mistreated before, you are powerless now. You cannot assume that because you have always helped, helping is still the right response. You cannot assume that because someone is disappointed, you have done something wrong. You become responsible for choices that no longer come with automatic moral approval. That responsibility creates another layer of calm. You stop waiting for universal permission. The psyche no longer needs to produce a crisis every time your conscious life becomes too narrow. Before integration, ignored needs often return through symptoms. Exhaustion appears where refusal was forbidden. Resentment appears where anger had no language. Procrastination appears where obedience has exceeded meaning. Fantasies of escape appear where the conscious personality insists that everything is fine. Jung understood symptoms not merely as defects to remove, but as messages from a psyche attempting to correct imbalance. This does not mean every psychological symptom has a simple symbolic explanation, or that professional care is unnecessary. It means your suffering may contain information about the life your conscious identity has refused to question. A man sits in his car outside his home long after turning off the engine. He scrolls without reading, postponing the moment he must enter and become agreeable again. When the porch light switches on, he locks the phone and stares at his reflection in the dark windshield. The exhaustion he has blamed on work begins to reveal another source. What you call burnout may include the cost of performing a self that no longer contains your truth. As integration deepens, you begin listening before the psyche needs to shout. You notice irritation before it becomes contempt. You notice fatigue before it becomes collapse. You notice attraction before it becomes obsession. You notice fear before it becomes control. This attention is not hypervigilance. It is relationship. You are no longer policing your inner life. You are allowing it to speak. That distinction matters. Shadow integration is not endless self-analysis. It is not turning every emotion into a puzzle, or treating every mistake as evidence of hidden pathology. Excessive introspection can become another defense, a way to remain inside your head rather than participate in life. Real integration eventually becomes ordinary. You notice envy and ask what it reveals. You recognize anger and decide what it serves. You feel shame and separate actual responsibility from old conditioning. You acknowledge desire without assuming it must either be obeyed or suppressed. You stop dramatizing the fact that you contain contradictions. Jung placed enormous importance on the tension of opposites. Psychological growth requires the capacity to hold conflicting truths without rushing to destroy one side. You can love someone and know you cannot remain close to them. You can be grateful for your past and still grieve what it cost. You can understand why someone acted as they did and still refuse the consequences of their behavior. A woman deletes a message she has written to an old friend. She had tried to explain that the relationship mattered and that it could not continue in its previous form. After reading the message several times, she sends a shorter version. She does not remove the affection, and she does not remove the boundary. What looks like contradiction may be your psyche becoming large enough to contain the whole truth. This ability creates the calm people often mistake for certainty. Integrated people are not always certain. They have simply become less terrified of ambiguity. They can make a decision while knowing part of them still wants the opposite. They can leave while feeling love. They can stay while acknowledging fear. They can apologize without collapsing into worthlessness. They can receive an apology without pretending the damage no longer matters. They do not need one feeling to cancel another. This is the psychological maturity Jung associated with individuation. You stop forcing yourself into a simplified identity. You become capable of carrying complexity without demanding immediate relief. But there is a deeper cost to this calm, and it is the part of integration that is easiest to romanticize and hardest to live. Once you see your shadow, you lose the comfort of unconsciousness. You can no longer blame every repeated pattern on bad luck. You can no longer call every sacrifice love. You can no longer describe your silence as peace when you know it is fear. You can no longer condemn other people for crossing boundaries you have refused to communicate. Awareness creates responsibility. That responsibility may require you to disappoint people who prefer your unconsciousness. It may require you to give up relationships organized around your wounded role. It may require you to admit that being needed gave you power, that being mistreated gave you moral certainty, or that being overlooked protected you from the risk of being fully seen. These admissions do not erase what happened to you. They expose what you have continued doing with it. The shadow beneath the shadow is often not rage, jealousy, or selfishness. It is the secret benefit you receive from remaining unchanged. As long as you are always the one who gives too much, you do not have to face the vulnerability of asking directly. As long as you are always surrounded by unavailable people, you do not have to discover what genuine intimacy would demand from you. As long as you remain misunderstood, you can preserve the fantasy that your unlived potential is greater than anything reality could test. Your suffering may be real, and part of you may still be invested in its structure. This is difficult to accept, because it sounds like accusation. It is not. It is the moment your power begins returning. A man complains that no one respects his time, yet answers every call immediately. He agrees to another request while resentment tightens his chest. Later, alone, he imagines telling everyone how much they have taken from him. What he does not yet want to see is that the fantasy of confrontation protects him from the smaller, more frightening act of saying no before resentment is available. The choice before you is rarely between comfort and pain. It is between familiar pain and unfamiliar responsibility. Integration may cost you the identity that made your life understandable. You may no longer be able to call yourself the good one, because goodness has become more complicated. You may no longer be able to call yourself powerless, because you can see the decisions through which you participate. You may no longer be able to call yourself endlessly forgiving, because you recognize how forgiveness became a way of avoiding conflict. You may become harder to explain. People who knew your persona may feel confused when you begin responding from a larger self. Your tenderness will remain, but it will no longer be compulsory. Your strength will remain, but it will include the ability to ask for help. Your independence will remain, but it will no longer require emotional isolation. Some relationships will adapt. Others were attached to the mask. You cannot know in advance which ones will survive. This uncertainty is part of the price. You must choose without being guaranteed approval, belonging, or recognition. You must act from an inner authority that is still imperfect, knowing that integration does not make you incapable of error. The mature psyche does not replace unconscious certainty with conscious certainty. It replaces certainty with responsibility. You will still misjudge people. You will still project. You will still discover motives you did not recognize. You will still act from old wounds and understand only later what happened. Integration does not grant purity. It grants the capacity to return. You can notice when the shadow has taken over without turning the discovery into self-hatred. You can repair what can be repaired. You can accept consequences that cannot be undone. You can revise your understanding without experiencing revision as humiliation. This is why integrated calm feels so different from emotional control. Control says, I must not feel this. Integration says, this feeling belongs to me, but it does not command me. Control says, I must remain the good person. Integration says, I must become conscious of what I am capable of. Control says, they must understand me before I can be at peace. Integration says, I can understand my own position even when they reject it. You are allowed to stop proving that you have no darkness. You are allowed to stop performing patience when anger has something necessary to say. You are allowed to stop calling your desires shallow simply because they do not match the identity you built for survival. You are allowed to admit that part of you wants recognition, rest, power, solitude, pleasure, revenge, admiration, freedom, or control. Admission is not obedience. You can acknowledge a desire without acting it out. You can recognize aggression and choose not to harm. You can feel envy and use it as information. You can admit the wish for revenge while refusing to organize your life around punishment. What you bring into consciousness becomes available for relationship, discernment, and choice. You are also allowed to stop treating calm as a performance. You do not need to speak softly while abandoning yourself. You do not need to smile while your body contracts. You do not need to prove your healing by remaining accessible to people who repeatedly injure you. You do not need to demonstrate spiritual maturity through endless tolerance. Sometimes integration will look like warmth. Sometimes it will look like a locked door. The difference is not the appearance of the act. The difference is whether the act comes from conscious relationship or unconscious compulsion. Your rare calm does not mean you have conquered the shadow. It means you no longer require conquest. You have stopped dividing your inner world into a hero who deserves love and an enemy who must remain hidden. You have begun allowing anger to stand beside compassion, vulnerability beside strength, selfishness beside generosity, and grief beside gratitude. None of these opposites has disappeared. They have stopped fighting for secret control. The calm you feel is not emptiness. It is the energy that becomes available when you no longer spend your life hiding from yourself. You may once have believed peace would arrive when the darker parts of you were finally silenced. Now you understand that peace arrives when they no longer need to break through the walls of your identity just to be acknowledged. That is the rare calm of shadow integration. You are not calm because nothing can disturb you. You are calm because disturbance no longer introduces you to a stranger. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you explore Jung's psychology and the path of individuation. Watch the video on your screen now to continue meeting the parts of yourself that have waited longest to be seen.